Welcome to episode 5.1 of Storycrafting. In episode 5, we began our discussion of voice, which was, at that point, we were summarizing as the things in your story. What's it about? In episode 5.1, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of word choice. What is it that makes your style? Previously, we talked about genres, which are those categories where your story might fit with other similar stories. These can be things like adventure, or romance, or horror. All kinds of details that you can get an idea of what key points do I need to add into my story to make it really click. We can go even beyond this into subgenres. So examples of this can be things like a fable, which is a fantasy, typically with talking animals, but the key point is it has a big moral lesson. Or a spy story, which is a type of thriller, so a type of adventure, but has to do with political intrigue and, spies. There's even, the Robinsonade, which is a story like Robinson Crusoe, where the protagonist has to struggle by living alone. So in looking at each of these, you can get an idea of what things might go into your story to make it really punchy. You should study the similarities in these stories to see what are the tropes of this genre or subgenre. So a trope is a common literary device. It's something that the audience expects to see. So for example, in a rom-com, there's always going to be a big shouting match argument, which is really just a misunderstanding that later on they'll resolve, probably through another discussion, and then happily ever after. Or in a Western, you've got the antagonist fleeing away with maybe the love interest or the treasure or whatever, and the hero is savvy enough that he can cut him off at the pass. Or post-apocalyptic stories, almost always in a desert, right? It kind of shows the theme of struggling to survive. These are all key elements that your audience will hopefully expect. But as you're writing your tropes, you want to make sure you don't use them as cliches. For example, if you're writing a story about an orphan who's taken in by adoptive relatives, and yet later finds out that he's the last in the line of mystic warriors, that sums up, 18 or 19 different fantasy stories right there. Instead, see what you can do to turn the trope on its head. How about if your protagonist is prophesied to be the great savior of the world? But maybe we can make this a little bit different. What if your protagonist hears this prophecy and doesn't believe it, refuses flat out that he wants to do anything, he just wants to be a farmer? Or maybe the prophecy's a lie. Somebody just made it up so that people could have hope, including the protagonist, who's going to be heartbroken when he finds out it doesn't really matter. Or what if the prophecy was made by kind of an evil cult, and their saving the world is actually conquering it, and now your protagonist is kind of pushed into this direction where he or she may end up being evil. All of those are novel takes which bring a trope that people are expecting and then turn it into something completely new that's going to engage them and make the story really strong. So working with tropes is another one of those delicate balances in writing. On the one hand, you want to make sure your audience knows what to expect, but on the other hand, you don't want it to be just a cliche story. Your audience might get confused when aliens show up in the middle of your cowboy revenge story, but then on the other hand, if you just wrote another cookie-cutter cowboy revenge story, they might as well read some Louis L'Amour and be over with. So a good way to balance this all out is to make sure that your premise really clicks. So premise, that one-sentence summary of what your story is about, capture the genre and subgenre, and then show what the twist is. What is it that makes your story special? For example, if your premise is a boy and a girl fall in love, that's a classic romance. People are going to hear that. But you might add a twist saying a boy and a girl fall in love, and it turns out the boy's a vampire. So now we've got the key vampire romance subgenre. So what's the twist that can make it even further? Maybe the boy and girl fall in love, the boy's a vampire, and the girl's also a vampire. Could be a good story. Or maybe there's a twist that's even more powerful out there that's waiting for you to write it. Now, voice is about more than just the overarching form of your story. As we get into more on style, we need to talk about word choice. So every single word you use is part of your voice. This stands out most clearly when you're working on the mood of your story. So the mood is kind of the overall feel of the scene or entire story that you're putting together. How does your particular use of which words make the audience feel? For some examples of these, we're going to look at poetry. So this will make the mood really stand out. Let's start off with Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. Rhyming aside, just listen to those words. Dreary, weary, forgotten lore. This is building up a very dark element that the audience gets drawn into, plodding along in mystery, and then somebody knocks at the door. It's shocking. Or listen to Wilfred Owen's description of World War I in Dulce et Decorum Est. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through the sludge. Till, on the haunting flares, we turned our backs, and toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod, all went lame, all blind. All these words are so harsh-sounding, beggars, sludge, and they're also done in very short, compact spots. So kind of what you'd hear if you were talking to somebody exhausted, who just had this little bit of phrasing that they would cough out before going back to hopefully asleep. Then there's super playfulness in Elizabeth Barrett Browning's A Musical Instrument. What was he doing, the great god Pan, down in the reeds by the river, spreading ruin and scattering ban, splashing and paddling with hooves of a goat, and breaking the golden lilies afloat? The words just make you feel better. They're peppy, they're a little bit mischievous. You want to find out what's going to happen next. Good word choice doesn't necessarily mean that every line is going to be poetry, but this is the opportunity to write your story in a way that your audience can live it as they read it. So paint a picture in which there's a storm and the wind is blowing on and on, howling through the rafters, and then a vicious strike of lightning. Otherwise, you'd end up with a story of repeating sentence structure, blah, Latinate words, and eventually you'll be reading a technical journal. But even if you have a scene that is kind of blah, like your protagonist rolling through rush hour, a few feet at a time, the soft gray of the road barely visible among the other cars, but then jerk, somebody pulls in front of him, cutting him off. Here we have long sentences and then short ones that pop. For practice with word choice and creating mood, I've included a worksheet in the info below. What you're going to do is take the first line and create 3 different stories in completely different genres. If you need help with the first line, check out writingexercises.co.uk. They have a random first line generator that will perhaps create a little story that you'll enjoy so much you might finish it beyond the exercise. I got The Family Had Been Cursed Since. First, of course, you got to start off with a horror story like that. The family had been cursed since they brought the wretched head into their house. Or how about a sports story? The family had been cursed since Billy, their quarterback, broke his wrist. His scholarship was in jeopardy, and he had to take the field in the big game. So, using keywords in sports stories, setting up that intrigue and anticipation of what's going to happen. Or even just a big drama, kind of a period piece. The family had been cursed since they snubbed Great Aunt Petunia's garden tea party. Now no invitations came to them for any event. Here we have something that's a little more prim and proper, but still gives that kind of dramatic appeal. In addition to choosing your words, you can also play around a lot with your sentences to maximize your style. Take Ernest Hemingway, for example. His sentences give a lot of impressions with just simple statements. They're lightning fast, short, simple, and punchy, such as, there were chimney swifts in the sky, or they all like laws. Or how about the single sentence from Virginia Woolf, where she shows her rapid, intelligent mind jumping from one bit of data to the next, using lots of Latinate words and parentheses in a long, complex thought. It was not to them, not to Hugh or Richard, or even to devoted Miss Brush, the liberator of the pent egotism, which is a strong, martial woman, well-nourished, well-descended, of direct impulses, downright feelings, and little introspective power. Broad and simple, why could not everyone be broad and simple, she asked. Feels rise within her. Once youth is past, and must eject upon some... And that's only half the sentence. Just like sentences can help define the style of your story, so can paragraphs. You can have short, choppy paragraphs with little tufts of dialogue, minimal description. Everything's going to read very, very fast, which is suitable for a thriller. But if you're writing something like a Regency romance, you're going to want to have these sweeping expositions, not only of history, but then some description of just what the room that they're all sitting in looks like. You'd have these big, expansive dialogues where somebody's prattling on, perhaps even over the thoughts of the reflective protagonist. And this will give a very different mood to your story, in which people will be kind of sharing in the slower pace and majesty of the time, instead of a thriller where they just want to punch through as quickly as possible. And then there are chapters, which is another unit of story. So going on down to the word, it's a single thought. It may be a noun or an action verb, but it's showing something within the story. And then you can have other words piled on top of that, creating a sentence, which is a unified thought. All of these words fitting together to show, a quick brown fox jumping over a lazy dog. It's a very vivid image. And then you can collect sentences into a paragraph, the next unit of story, where you give maybe a bigger group of details, large description, or a whole selection of dialogue where somebody's giving some exposition or reflecting. And then, of course, the next stage up is the chapter, which is a unit of story in which a singular tied group of events comes together. So in your chapter length, maybe you want to have them real quick and choppy. So if you look at Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, chapters are maybe 2 or 3 pages. And it really works. People read through and they get to another chapter and they think, wow, this is so quick. And so they keep reading more and more and more, flipping those pages as they're on a plane ride because it's so thrilling and because it's so easy with short chapters. Or you could have kind of a longer system of chapters. So in Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien's going to have page upon page upon page of description of these dead marshes, maybe throwing in some history, lots of description, very vivid details in which the audience can participate on this long journey going toward Mordor. Whatever the length of the chapters in your story, don't let them end in a blah manner. So there's the classic, if your character falls asleep at the end of the chapter, so will your audience. Instead, leave it with a cliffhanger. And this is something that can show the disaster, what's going to happen next in the story, or maybe it's something that dramatically pops up leading into the next scene. Whatever it is, you want to make sure that the audience is gripped. Master of this is R.L. Stine with his classic Goosebumps series. A lot of them were kind of cheap jump scares and lingering things that were twisted into something that didn't matter in the end. It was just somebody in a costume. But it does show pretty effectively the way that you can grip the audience's mind and have this portion of the story done, but they're already thinking about what's going to happen next. While we're talking about length, one question that often comes up is, how long should my story be? Most times, writers will start out to write a short story or a novel, but often it's better to let the story question determine this. So if it's a real simple story question, a singular protagonist going after a singular goal, maybe that's kind of a short story, something real quick and easy. If it's a more complex story with multiple protagonists across multiple storylines, now we're getting into novel territory. If you're writing, microfiction, which is just a few words, or flash fiction, just a few hundred words, short stories up to 5,000 or 6,000 words, novellas up to 20 or 40,000 words, and then full novels and even series, all of these are going to be different story questions stretching out as far as they need to go. So think about, what is your story? What content do you need to put into it? Do you want to build an entire world and have multiple kingdoms with lots of history and background? Well, you're going to need at least a novel and probably several protagonists to really get in depth and tell this story. But if you just want to tell a simple story, something real quick, resolve a mystery, well, maybe that's really just better for a short story. Think, what is your story question, and let that guide you. Your style helps determine every part of your story, from the words you choose to set up your mood, to the complexity of your sentences, to the lengths of your paragraphs, when your chapters begin and end, and even what genre you're writing in. So think about the tropes and think about your words as you're putting together your story throughout. All right, that's it for episode 5.1 of Storycrafting. Writers, keep writing.